So now that we are going back on track with what I've been speaking over the past couple months, really building a spiritual selves, a spiritual formation, laying the groundwork for what God wants to do in your life. We've discussed several things about how to view God correctly, in an orthodox way, in a correct view, in our Christian view of Him. Also how to view ourselves correctly, how to love ourselves correctly as God views us, and then how to love others compassionately. So this morning I wanted to talk about trusting God. Trusting and faith, they're really knitted together. You really can't have one without the other. And I know faith in Christian congregations and Christian circles, faith is thrown around so much, but I want to really dig into that. And what does faith really mean? What does it have? And it really means to have trust in God. You can say you have faith. Yes, I believe in God, but are you truly trusting God in all aspects of your life? And it's a little bit more. It's more of an action in doing in your faith and in your walk. Being able to trust God with all your heart, with your family, your finances, your jobs, the very things that you closely identify with. So I wanted to talk about trust and how there is a need to have a trust with God, an intimacy, a true connection with God. You can have a friend that you trust, but if you hide certain things from them, you're really only showing a part of you. And that's something that a lot of us do with God. We only let God come so far into our lives. Where, okay, we leave you here within these four walls, but when I walk outside, I rely on my own dependence, my own self-doing, my own will, and in my own self-righteousness, as we think we are. But it really goes further than that. You have to understand that you can't hide anything from God. And we need to build this true connection with God. And it's going to take trust. And for a lot of us, trust is such a difficult thing because it requires us to be vulnerable. How many of you guys like to be vulnerable in here? I sure don't. I don't want to see you guys watch me cry. To be in pain and to have agony and suffering and things that we've experienced from trusting others. So can you trust God? Because for a lot of us millennials that I talk to when I'm preaching to the youth, it's something that they're struggling with. Can I trust God in all facets of my life? And I see it. Like, you trust God in this, but you're not trusting God here. So trust needs to be all-consuming in your faith. Join me in reading Hebrews chapter 11. And I wanted to talk about the story of Abraham, the father of faith. When you really look at what happened in Abraham's story, how God chose this man, and through this man there would be a great blessing for all of humanity. If you want to read more into it, it's between Genesis 12 and then the death of Abraham in Genesis 25. But it would be way too much to cover in a Sunday morning. So I chose to read Hebrews 11 because it's going to talk about faith and it's going to reference back to Abraham and how he had faith and how he entrusted God with everything that he had. And it will talk about Abraham in verse 8, but we will read the first three verses quickly. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. See, when we talk about faith and trust, us as beings, we look at things through our physical eyes. Through what we see and what we perceive, that's how we base trust. We can look at gravity, we can measure it, we can look at a scientific way of measuring things that we know that exist. But when I wanted to talk about this here because we have to understand that all creation is the doing of God, the will of God. So when we look back, right before we talk about trust, we're going to talk about God, who he is, the power that he has, the authority that he has. When it talks about his creation, that God can make something out of nothing, something that it's hard for us to comprehend. God didn't make something and make something else out of it, out of nothingness, out of void, darkness, out of nothing. He created all that we see, as far as we can see in the universe. So first and foremost, we have that faith and confidence in God, in his creation. So we start first with our biblical worldview of the way we look at scriptures, the way we look at faith, the way we look at trust. So then we're going to jump down to verse 8. And this is where it's going to start talking about a little bit about Abraham. And, okay, we have it. And we will be reading 8 to 19. By faith, Abraham. Now remember, when it says faith, this is Abraham placing his trust. So when we read this, think about faith as an action, him trusting when these things occur. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went. Even though he did not know where he was going, by faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents as Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him in the same promise. Remember, that's his child and his grandson. So you're going to see the promise continue through the generation. 10. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who made the promise. 12. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they were looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had the opportunity to return. 16. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. 17. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. So in this manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. So there's a lot here to unpack. So quickly, summing up the story of Abraham. Abraham was living comfortably in his land. I think it was like Haran. And God is calling him to go. He's sending him. You have to understand the context here. They're living like in the desert. So for someone to tell you, hey, I need you to get all your stuff and move to the middle of Arizona, would you do it? Where you don't have the resources, you don't have the comfort of your family, your livestock, your food, everything that you have, your whole life, whatever is constructed of. He tells them and he sends them, go. That first and foremost is trust. That wherever he goes, he's going to carry the blessing from God and he's going to be sent. And then what happens a few years later is that there's this great famine. Don't you think for him quickly he would throw it in God's face? Well, why did you send me out here? There's no food. And that's where he goes to Egypt. And he goes to Egypt in search for resources. And so scared that he tells his wife, hey, don't tell them that I'm your husband. Because if they do, they're going to kill me and take you, because Abraham's wife was very beautiful. Very, very beautiful. So much that the Pharaoh wanted her. And he told him, don't tell him that I'm your husband. Just say I'm your brother. That way I'll be saved. They won't kill me. And guess what? They ended up getting blessed with so many things. But eventually the Pharaoh wanted Sarah as his queen. And that's where they got sent away. And he said, get out of here. Why'd you have to lie to me? I wanted your wife, but I can't have her because that's yours. It's things that happen that we have to place our trust in, is that when you trust God, sometimes it feels like we're going into a valley where it's going to be very dark. And these things that are said here is that they never got to see these promises that God told them about, because they have a lot of descendants. They never got to see them. Let alone did they think they could have a child. I believe he was like 99, almost 100 years old, Abraham was, when he had his son. And Sarah at 90. Could you be able to place that kind of trust in God when he's telling you to go somewhere? I have a promise for you. I have a land for you. In here, this place will be yours. And from there, you will have an abundance of families that will be your descendants. Something that Abraham never got to see. Imagine right now how he's probably looking down at his nation of Israel. That all of that came from him being faithful. We can't stop what God wants to do in our lives because we don't trust him in certain aspects. And whatever aspects we could struggle with. I'm human too. I've reached low points in my life where I didn't trust God in certain things. I've been scared. I can only imagine how scared Abraham was when God told him, hey, go into the desert. Who knows if you'll survive, as he probably thought to himself. But he had that trust in God that God would protect him. And out of this, how much an abundance would come. And then think about it. He tells you, I'm going to bring a nation out of you, meaning you're going to have an offspring. You're going to have a child. And as soon as he gets the kid, he tells them and tests them, I need you to sacrifice this for me. I need you to place this child and sacrifice it for me. Could you parents imagine doing that? If God told you to do that? After promising you these things, to do something like that? Something to us that probably don't have a biblical worldview would be hard for us to understand this concept of bringing something pleasing to God, something innocent to God. But yet, Abraham trusted him. At the very point of doing so, he stopped him and he tested his faith. And through his faith, he was made righteous. A lot of us think that, doing certain things or good deeds make us righteous. No, but it's our faith that God imparts some of his righteousness into us. So when we come before God, he's pleasing. He's very well pleased in ourselves when we come before him. I wanted to give an example of certain things that I've dealt with in trust. There was this young adult that I've been kind of talking to. He was raised here, got baptized in this very area of the church, but he no longer comes to church. So then I talked to him, and I'm like, hey, man, what's going on? When are you going to come to church? Or, hey, how's it doing? And then, we ended up getting a little bit theological. And I started talking to him, well, how's everything going, dude? Like your walk, your faith. And he's like, you know what? I left because everybody was condemning me for looking for another truth. And I was like, okay. I believe the truth is in the scriptures. But to him, maybe it wasn't sufficient. It wasn't enough for him. He probably didn't trust the word of God enough that he has to look for it somewhere else. So then I started talking to him. I'm like, okay, well then, what do you believe? And he's like, well, I don't know. There is that idea of heaven and hell, but I don't like it, so I push it aside. And, people just condemn me, and when I don't do things, they just want to send me to hell. I'm like, okay, so then what do you believe? So he's like, well, I don't know, man. Maybe we come back into life somehow. I'm like, oh, okay, so you think life is cyclical. It starts over, it ends, and starts over again. And I started telling him, hey, you have a little bit of an Eastern, Far East religious perspective in your faith. And then he's like, oh, well, I guess, but I don't think that's it either. I'm like, okay, so what do you believe? Well, I mean, there's always that as a possibility. And then there's the other possibility that just nothing happens after we die. And I was like, man, so you're a nihilist. And he's like, well, what's that? Oh, well, nihilists say that, there is no religious or moral principles that we can attribute to. There is no sense of purpose. There is no sense of meaning. I'm like, dude, that's sad. And he's just like, yeah, it's pretty depressing. And I'm like, dude, that is depressing. And I told him, hey, the problem with nihilists is that when they are really true nihilists, they're actually very suicidal. Because to which point do you not just take your own life? Because all this is here is we're hedging our bets. Or what he was doing, he's hedging his bets. He's spreading his bets on his different worldviews, his different beliefs. Well, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. But for us here, we're convinced that the scriptures is true, that you are saved by your faith. And for this young man, he was kind of hedging his bets a little bit, kind of covering himself. But at the very end of it, when he looked at it in a very nihilistic perspective, what's stopping you from just killing yourself if there is no meaning to life, there is no purpose, there is nothing to it? And some people sink into that depression. Be very, very careful when you start to eliminate God out of the picture. Or when you start to think that everything is relative. Well, your truth is relative. My truth is relative. Well, will you trust in the Bible? Because we're talking about trust and faith. Well, that's relative to you. Okay, then there is no moral principle. There is no one standard. And when you start to dive into all these different philosophies and you start to and place some of your trust in them, being convinced of it, all it really is delusion. And for me, when I got a little bit separated from the church, I dove into all these things. I dove into a little bit of, New Age. I dove into a little bit of Hinduism. I dove into a little bit of Buddhism. Because I wanted to search, what other truths are there? And rightfully, you should. A lot of us doubt God when we first come to God. We don't trust God. We don't trust what this says. We're going to go and look for other options, so to speak. And at first, I'll take it. Because I have a lot of youth that tell me, well, is doubting God good or bad? Okay, you're implying that you doubt God. Okay, but that's fine. When you first come to God, yes, it's okay, doubt. Because you just don't know. But when you read the scriptures, when God reveals himself to you, when his Spirit speaks to your heart, and you start to realize that of all this, you will be most persuaded of will be the scriptures instead of all these other things. When you realize that in Hinduism, when you look at their sacred texts or Vedas, it's just a bunch of baloney. No offense to the Hindus. But I've read through it. And yeah, they predate, I think they're like 4,000 years before the birth of Christ. But these stories are just stories. And they too believe time is cyclical. So in all these aspects, I start to tell them, okay, well, let's hone in on what you believe. And unsure of himself, the young adult that I was speaking with, he was like struggling. Almost put up against the wall, but I wasn't trying to do that. But hey, if you're going to believe something, identify what you believe with. Because if not, you're just avoiding what God is trying to do with you. You're avoiding the scriptures. You're avoiding the humility that comes when you read this stuff. You avoid your sinful nature because the light of God reveals our true selves. That without him, we are absolutely nothing. And that's something that some of us millennials are struggling with. I understand that you're searching for your own truth. I understand that you're trying to find yourself. Yes, I went through that phase as well. But sooner or later, you got to place your bet. We're all a ticking time bomb. We're all going to end. And what's going to happen? Yes, you were born. Be glad that of existence. You're able to experience life. But then what's going to happen? If you think you're so powerful that you can stop yourself and become immortal, then you got it twisted. But at the end of it all, everyone in here will cease to exist, at least in our physical selves. So what does that tell me? The world we see is not the only world that exists, but there is a spiritual world. And that's where faith comes in. That's where trust comes in. That's where in here, when we read about Abraham, I believe it said from a distance, they welcomed. And I believe here when he says, let me read through it real quick. 13. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised, but only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. Spiritually, I believe they welcomed them because they had trust in God. That these things that you're promising to me will come to fruition. That yes, your promises will be kept. You'll keep your word, God, because you told me this. I believe it. Even though I'll never see it, I'll believe it. That's a lot of trust. For some people, it's too much trust. It's like, God, you're asking way too much of me. I need to live now. I need to live in the temporal system, the way I view things, and things that I can grasp and touch. This spiritual world you speak of, I don't want to worry about it. It's too confrontational for me to think about my innermost, deepest self, my soul, and realize the state you're in. And that brings me to these two value systems that we can hold. One was a temporal, meaning it demands no trust and dependence upon God because it is based on what's seen. It's pleasure, recognition of popularity, wealth, status, power, and all that leads to emptiness, delusion, and foolishness. Just like I told a young adult, the things you're looking for, you'll see in a couple of years. Keep thinking the way you think, and we'll see what comes to fruits in your faith or in your worldview, which may or may not be biblical. Versus this eternal value system that we need to cultivate. This system that we need to. It's hard. Trust me, it's not easy, because for me to comprehend eternity is impossible with our finite minds. Our minds are limited to how much you can memorize, to how much you can. Trust me, how many of you guys forget things? All right? That alone tells you that we are limited upon our own biological selves and what we can understand. But how do we cultivate this eternal value system? It is unseen, therefore it requires a walk of faith. We're coming back to this word faith. But faith is too easily thrown around. People tattoo faith here. The bracelet says faith. Faith, you know. Okay, but are you living it? Are you putting it into action? Are you trusting God when you go through hardships? That's where your faith comes alive. When your faith becomes trust. I have two quick verses here. 2 Corinthians 5:7. Read them real quick. You guys don't have to go there. They'll be on the board. For we live by faith, not by sight. Romans 8:24 and 25. For we live by faith, not by sight. And then turn to Romans 8:24, 25. So in your walk, you can't live by sight. It's got to be faith. And then Romans 8:24 and 25, it reads, for in this hope we were saved. But hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? I'll read that part again. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not have, we wait patiently. Abraham waited. A lot of us, we live too much, and maybe we can blame it on culture for our need for instant gratification, but we have to wait. The things of God cannot be easily given to you. What do you mean, Pastor? I actually have to read my Bible? Yes, read your Bible. What do you mean, Pastor? I have to get on my knees and pray every morning? Yes, you need to communicate with God. How can you trust someone you don't know? If you trust your friend, that means, hey, you talk to them. You guys have a friendship. You guys cultivate that closeness, that intimacy where you can, hey, I trust you. You trust me. You're not going to backstab me. Well, how do you know God if you don't have any communication with God? See, these things here, most people don't bother because it's work. If God freely gave this to you, I don't think you truly cherish it. Salvation is freely given. Yes, believe and you will be saved. But if you really want to cultivate that trust in God, it's going to take some work. It's going to take a little bit of exercise. Exercising your spiritual selves. And these things in this eternal value system, they will bring you into knowledge of God, knowing who God is. When you know God more deeper and greater, how much more passionately can you be about God, about your faith? When you trust God in all aspects of your life, your approval of God. Because some of us don't approve of God. People get so mad when I talk to them. And they're like, no, I don't like your God because your God does this and does that. And like, what do you mean? Not to get into it, but when you realize who God is, he gains your trust. He gains your approval. Oh God, man, how can I not devote myself to you? And turns into servanthood. That was another point I had here. And this eternal value, your service here is temporary because your reward is eternal. And a lot of us need to build up our servanthood in our service to one another in this new church, in this new body, this new congregation. I like that a lot of the people in here jump to 11. That's good. Stay there. I want to know who the family is going to be. The 11 o'clock, no, the 9:30, which is us. This is the body. When you look around, I want you to begin to start to trust these people. Build the relationship. Because we can have it all here with God on the vertical, but we're also commanded to be on the horizontal. Just as Christ, the most perfect example, he gave himself for the church. Are we not to do the same? For that family, this body? Something to think about, a little food for thought. It builds integrity and character. Because when you focus on the eternal, you're going to value that integrity. You're going to have integrity in the things that you do. Because you know that the decisions you make here can have an eternal effect. Let alone did Abraham think his decision there would have an eternal effect. Through the lineage of Abraham comes Jesus Christ. 1,500 years later, God was preparing the way in the fullness of time to redeem the world back to him. How important is it for us to have trust in God, just as Abraham did? Brings forth humility. And all these, it springs forward trust in God. Fulfillment for our lives. A more so reality of what's to occur. We live in this reality, well, there's an eternal reality that's to come, a spiritual realm. And it brings forth wisdom. And these are the system that we need to cultivate. We say system because in academic terms, that's what it is. It's a perspective. It's a value system that we attribute to. And that's something that we here need to do as well. As we build our spiritual selves, we need to place all trust in God. And it's a challenge. I'm not saying it's easy. Because when the hardships come, you're going to try and do everything on your own dependence. Speak to the elders. They'll tell you. I heard a giggle back there because it's true. The hardships will come, but will you trust God? And there's so much we could talk about Abraham. I only talked the glimpse just because in Hebrews, that's what he reminds the Hebrews about. Because these Hebrews, they're at the break of turning back to their old selves. That's why the author of Hebrews is telling them, don't go back to the law. The supremacy of Christ, the fullness of Christ, the Jesus as Christ himself is enough. Let alone these priests had their job security in the law because they had a job. So see how they try to worry more about themselves? And when the author of Hebrews is addressing this. Because when we get here to chapter 11, he's telling them by faith. Have faith. Don't have faith in the law. Don't have faith in your works. And that's the old system. Jesus came to fulfill the law. So now everything that's done from here on forward is done through Christ. Christ was the last sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice, holy and pleasing and sinless before God. And that's where salvation comes, because he did that for us all. Stop basing your trust in God on the situation. This is in conclusion. Or the things that are temporary. It is only a season, and this too shall pass. The various seasons we go through. The trust can't just be in and out of season. It's got to be through it all. We need to set our eyes on eternity, trust God. And I'll leave it there. But I do want to challenge you guys. This week, trust God. There's going to be a moment where maybe God's going to try and talk to you. Hey, go say hi to this person. Or maybe God's going to be like, hey, I need you to pray. We need to talk. Or hey, you need to ask for forgiveness. Or whether it's in your job. Some of you guys are worried about your job or your careers or what college you're going to go to. Trust God. See if he doesn't reveal himself to you in that. In whatever aspect, because all of us here are carrying a testimony, if you are a believer. So the challenge this week, in whatever aspect each one of you needs to build that trust in, I challenge you to do it this week. Until we come back next week, then we can discuss about something else. Does that sound good? Are you guys going to do it? I may not know the situation of each one of you guys, but trust is something that we can all continue to build. Once the elders, yeah, my trust is solid, but there's always like one little thing, you know. And for us young people, we need to trust God in a lot of things. Our futures, our finances, our careers, our families, our relationships. Let God be in there. Let God be in the center. Once you begin to place that trust in God, man, you don't have to worry about anything. Quickly, before I had, when me and my wife were searching for a house, I told God, this is what I want. Whether we were able to achieve it, you know, was going to be the hard part. It ain't easy not to buy a house in Paris. Paris is on the up, as you can see. So I trusted God, I placed faith, and we prayed about it. And eventually, you know, I talked to a couple realtors, and they're like, well, for this price and for what you want, dude, you're smoked out. You're not going to get it. He's like, well, you're going to get for this, it's going to be like a broken down mobile home, da-da-da. And I was like, hey, I'm not shallow. I'll live in a shack if I have to, because my faith isn't God. This is temporary. This world that we perceive is temporary. So opportunity opened up First day on the market, we're like, dude, let's go look at this. It's a good price. And for some reason, God was just like, he opened the opportunity. So we went and we go. And we walked in. Oh my God. It was ugly. It was nasty. It was an elder divorced gentleman in a wheelchair with lung cancer or something, smoked in the house. The walls were yellow. He trapped cats in the house. So there's pee, I wasn't going to say piss, but pee everywhere, mold everywhere. So much that he shipped in cats from across the state. And so it was just cat hair everywhere. The thickness of hair. It never cleaned anything. When we removed the fridge, it was a horror to see cat poop everywhere, on the ceilings. And I was like, God, here? In this nastiness? Was I going to trust God and be like, dude, this is where I'm going to bring in my firstborn? But it took a lot of humility. Be like, yes, here is where you're going to build your family. Here is where I'm going to place you. Just as Abraham was placed in the desert with nothing, where there's Canaanites, where there's pagan gods, and where Sodom and Gomorrah was, where we already know where all the evilness was, in this very place, God placed us there. And by faith, we decided, okay, we're going to buy it. And we're in the process of that. We're remodeling because I'm not going to move in a new point with cat hair and who knows what else in there. So much that this guy had an electric fence controller so the cats couldn't escape. There was like, it was disgusting, to be nice about it. I think she's leaving because she's mad. But it takes trust in all aspects. Something as simple as that, well, not that simple, but in every aspect. In the next decision you make, trust God and ask God. Because some people try and say, well, there's various choices to make. No, there is a correct choice. If you pray to God, God is trying to send you somewhere. For the college students that's deciding, well, what college do I go to? I got accepted into 3. Well, there's a choice that you're going to have to make. Pray to God about it. And God will call you to the path that he's designed for you and made a purpose for you. Because much too many times we try to veer away from God's plan, God's purposes. But when you submit and you trust God, you humble yourself to not make decisions on your own, man, it's such a blessing to have that protection, to have that confidence in God. It's a beautiful, beautiful feeling. And I hope all of us here in our spiritual selves can cultivate that and begin to trust God. So we'll end there. I'm going to ask you guys to stand up, and we're going to pray about it.